And thank you everybody for joining us for our last of the Jewish Communities Around the World series. We're very happy to the final episode with our very own Mirensky about the Jews of Argentina. Thank you. And please stay tuned for future programs, Lunch and Learns, other mini-series that are coming up. So please, if you're not on our email list, you're not on our WhatsApp group, please feel free to message me and I'll be happy to send you the link.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining me on this across the history of the Jewish community in Argentina. So first, a little bit of history. We're going to interlace a little bit of my own family experience, as well as general history of the Jewish community. So the Jewish immigration to Argentina started somewhere around the middle of the 19th century, 1850. From Western Europe, but it was drips and drops. Really, in earnest, it started toward the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, 1895, 1905, at the same time as the first Aliyah to Eretz Israel. I don't know if everybody knows, but there were three programs to build a Jewish state. One was by the Rothschild family and was in Eretz Israel. There was also from the Jewish Congress, especially on the left side, the left wing, politically left wing of the Jewish Congress, to build it in Uganda. And there was also one by Baron Hirsch to build a Jewish state in Argentina. Now, as you can imagine, at that time, goodbyes were really goodbye. As a matter of fact, Naomi and I are leaving for Israel this coming Thursday, and we were a little bit upset. We have not been in Israel for 5 years, and because of COVID. And families were not able to visit us so much. So we have not seen people really, most of our family, for the last 5 years, and we were quite upset about it. This time, when they used to leave, it was really forever. And as Rabbi Goren writes in his book about Rabbi Goren, who was the chief rabbi famous during the 6-Day War. So he writes in his book that in spite of his father having contracted malaria, and in spite of the hard work in drying the swamps and in general the problems that they had, there was never a thought in the family of going back, simply because there was nowhere to go back to. So when the immigrants, these pioneers, arrived to Argentina, they were given they had a program that was a mixture between what today is a kibbutz and a moshav. They used to give them a small parcel of land. They used to share on the production equipment and some of the animals for work, and they used to sell their product as a cooperative. So there were a lot of villages that were built. The most prominent ones, there were 6 in the province of Entre Rios, which is here. Provinces in Argentina are the same actually as what here are the states. So there were 6 in Entre Rios. There was one, the biggest one, in Santa Fe, in the province of Santa Fe, called Moises Villa. That was the biggest one. And there were 2 in the province of Buenos Aires. That land, the one in the province of Buenos Aires, was not that good. It was very, very hard land to work. And there were 2 colonies. One was Lapin, and the other one, very, very important, super important, Rivera. Why was it so important? Because that's where my grandparents landed. So my grandparents arrived in 1905 with the parents of my grandfather, The parents and the family of my grandmother had been murdered during a pogrom in Kiev. So they arrived in 1905. Now, they were, as usually Jewish families are, very, very much into education. So slowly, these farms started, the family started traveling toward Buenos Aires, the capital, the city, the big city. The population in Argentina is very concentrated in the city of Buenos Aires. About 50% of the population is in Buenos Aires. So culturally, educationally, the possibilities of progress, they're mainly in Buenos Aires, they always were. So they started moving toward Buenos Aires. And from the family of my dad, there were 5 brothers. My dad was the first one that moved to the city. He was 13 years old. So he started going to high school at night. He went to one of the 2 high schools that were dependent on the University of Buenos Aires. So interesting enough, 45 years later, I went to the same school. But he started we used to work at night, study at night and work during the day. Essentially, he had one job all of his life. He started in that company when he was 13, and he left when he was 33 as the controller. And he left because he started his own textile factory. So other immigrants also arrived, some of them directly to Buenos Aires. For example, my grandparents, the parents of my mom, arrived in 1915, and they arrived to Buenos Aires from Poland. Incidentally, my grandparents from the side of my dad were from Russia, Kiev and Russia. So they arrived from Poland. Also very, very inclined to education. They arrived with 2 sons. And in 1917, my mom was born. And again, like most of the Jewish families that were very, very into education and progressing through education, my mom was the first pharmacist in Argentina. She studied 1930s, early 1930s. So of course, to have a woman studying university, especially in Latin America, was really rare. Certainly science was unheard of. But she was really a very, very strong-willed person, really very strong-minded. A little bit later, 1930s, and middle of the 1930s, there also was a wave of immigration from North Africa and from Turkey, the Sephardim Jews, primarily from Turkey, Egypt, and Morocco. It's interesting that there are about, the Jewish community in Argentina, about 20–30% is Sephardi, and about 80–70% is Ashkenaz. It's difficult to say because there is a lot of mixed marriage between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. As a matter of fact, in my own family, my brother was married into a Sephardi family. I have aunts that were married into Sephardi families. It's very, very common. Now, the Jews that arrived in Argentina, they did not congregate around religious observance. They were really, for the most part, especially the ones that came from Eastern Europe, were not particularly religious, observant. So they mainly connected through activities, political and social activities. They tended to be a lot on the left side. So a lot of, they were very, very active in the Communist Party, the Socialist Party. They were very, very Zionist. Of course, as I mentioned, a lot of them came with the program of Baruch Hirsch of building a Jewish state. So they were Zionists, of course, looking into staying in Argentina, but mainly the idea of having a Jewish state, they were was very much in their mind. They did have a high cultural life. There are a lot of newspapers, Jewish newspapers. We had a lot of schools, Jewish schools, but primarily secular schools. There were, however, three very, very large, very important synagogues. One was in the Paso Street, which is in an area of Buenos Aires called Once, which is it's an Orthodox synagogue. There was a very, very important synagogue for the conservative movement. The conservative movement was very, very prominent in Argentina until the 90s. And the main synagogue was in Libertad Street, very, very big synagogue. And there was also a synagogue, as you can see, a Moroccan synagogue. That one is very, very important because that's where I had my bar mitzvah. But again, just concentrated mainly around social activities and sports activities. So the two main centers were Hebraica, Sociedad Hebraica, which was mainly a social type of club in downtown Buenos Aires. They had some inside sports like water polo, and they used to have a summer camp. I went to that summer camp quite a lot. And ACOA was more on the sports, on the outside sports. They had a lot of, they had a quite good rowing team. I was a member of the rowing team when I was in high school. So again, and they also participated in the Maccabiadas. And it's very interesting. They had a summer camp. I went to, we usually used to go all over the place, but primarily to the southwest of Argentina. And I went when I was 9 or 10 years old, that summer camp in the southwest. And 10 years later, I was in Hebrew University and I was showing slides from Argentina. So I was showing slides of the day camp. And one of my friends in Hebrew U suddenly jumped and said, "That's me, that's me, that's me." So I had a photograph, for some reason, a photograph of him. Of course, 10 years earlier, I didn't recognize him when I met him in Hebrew U. He was one of my aides in my wedding. The Argentina prospered a lot, and with it, of course, the Jewish community prospered a lot. Shamefully, Argentina did not declare war on Germany until 1945. So really, it was really, really shameful, but that was what it was. And of course, there was a lot of prosperity during the years of the war and immediately after the war. Most of the world was in disarray, obviously. And Argentina had a lot of grain and a lot of meat and a lot of food in general. And of course, very little competition for products that we used to manufacture. Now, the Jewish community mainly concentrated for some reason on the textile industry. My dad had a textile factory. And as you can see, there was also some religious observance. You have a kosher deli. I used to go a lot there with my dad, about certainly once a month at least. We used to go and buy a deli to bring home, kosher deli. All right, so we get to 1943. 1943, there's one of Argentina's most common pastimes. There was a military coup. They have a military coup very, very often. So in this military coup in 1943, so Juan Perón was a colonel, and he became Ministry of Labor. And while he was being Ministry of Labor, he realized that there is an untapped potential with the working class, the blue-collar working class. So in 1946, he made a coup. And after he made a coup, he promoted himself from colonel to a 3-star general. And he also thought that in order to have a president that thinks like himself, the best would be he himself. So he also placed himself as the president. Now, why is this important to us for the Jewish community? It was a very, very corrupt government, extremely corrupt. And immediately after the war, obviously they got a lot of payments. And what happened is they let a lot of Nazis come in right after the war, and they predominantly settled in the southwest, west southwest. I mentioned before, it's an area of lakes and mountains, beautiful area. And of course, we used to go on vacations a lot to that area. And of course, every time you met somebody who was German of the quote unquote right age, immediately you had to think, wonder what were you doing in the 1930s, 1940s. One of the most prominent Nazis, of course, was Otto Freitman. He used to be in the area of Buenos Aires. He was captured by the Mossad in 1961, brought to Israel in 1962. He stood trial, he was convicted, and he was hung. But also, Mengele was supposed, there were scenes of Mengele around the Northeast. There were scenes of Bormann going around. So there were, regretfully, quite a lot of them. The important thing about that is that brought about, incidentally, there was always an undercurrent of anti-Semitism in Argentina. Argentina is a very, very Catholic country, more so maybe in the 20s, 30s, but even today, very, very Catholic country. And before John 23rd, the church was really not totally did not apologize for their bad relation with the Jews. So that, of course, filtered to the people in general. So always there was that undercurrent of anti-Semitism. With the influx of the Nazis, the ultra-nationalist right-wing groups became really prominent. One of them, Tacuara, was very, very violent and became very prominent. In the 1960s, there were a lot of really violent acts against young Jews, Jews coming up from Hebraic, as I said before, continuously. Two morale boosters in the 1960s, of course, was one, yes, the capture of Eichmann by the Mossad and bringing him to trial. And the other one, of course, the Six-Day War. As most probably here in the States, we were very, the Jewish community in Argentina was very, very concerned about the Six-Day War. Before the Six-Day War was a lot of insecurity. And incidentally, both the acts of Tacuara and these two boosts, we can say that were my first two seeds of Zionism, of really deciding that I was going to go to Israel once I finished high school, really took root. So, on a personal note, on March 31st, 1973, I left my home, my parents, my family, my friends, and I left with the Eugenia C, at that time was a super duper ship, and I arrived in Haifa on April 19, 1973. I made Aliyah. Oops. So 1975, that was 1973, 1975 comes around and Juan Perón comes back. Juan Perón had been, after he was overthrown in a coup in 1955, and he was sent to exile to Spain. In 1975, he comes back with his second wife. The first wife, if you heard about the musical Evita, the first wife was that one, the first wife, Eva Perón. This one is the second wife. He had this thing about go-go dancers. So this one was a go-go dancer in Spain. And why is it important to us? Because regretfully, he came back in 1975. The president that brought him in was from the Peronist Party. After the last coup, they let the Peronist Party participate. The Peronist Party won. They brought him back, and he came with his second wife. And so he ran again for the presidency, and he had to put somebody in the ticket. And the problem is there were so many groups from such different factions that had worked to bring him to Argentina that it was a problem for him to choose a vice president for the ticket from any particular faction. So what did he do? He put her, who was totally apolitical, and that's what he did. The only problem is that that was 1975. 1976, he died. And she was so moronic, for lack of another word, that she thought she really can be president. So she took the power, and she was very manipulated. And what came out of that is what's known as the Argentinian Dirty War. It was essentially a civil war. So the left used to do really their share of atrocities. They used to attack police stations and army quarters. In Argentina, there was a drought. So a lot of the people they used to kill, besides from civilians, were these kids that were really doing their military service in the police or the military service in the army, and had nothing to do with what they were trying to fight against. And again, they were terrorist groups, essentially, for all intents and purposes. Now, interesting enough, you cannot say that a large percentage of the Jewish population, of the Jewish community, was part of these subversive groups, but there was a very high percentage of Jewish young people in these subversive groups, a much higher percentage than the general population, general Jewish population. So when they used to capture them, or when they used to kill them, or whatever, it came out a lot of Jewish names, which made deeper even the confrontation with the ultra-nationalist right groups. And that brings us to the 90s, two big terrorist attacks in Buenos Aires against the Jewish community in the 1990s. In 1992, a bomb on the Israeli embassy downtown. Thankfully, there were not that many victims during that because nobody was in the building. But there were a lot of victims in 1994. There was a bomb in the AMIA, which is like the general social services for the Jewish community in Argentina in general. It was done by, known now especially, by Iranian agents. And Iran did a deal with Christina Kirchner, who's now the vice president, the president two cycles ago. And she got money, as usual. And those people were let go, There was a prosecutor that was trying to find out or investigate the whole deal. And suddenly the day he had to, because his appearance in court to present the case, he was found dead, supposedly by suicide, obviously, big question mark, right? Argentina being a much younger Jewish community than what you have in Europe or the Far East, obviously we did not have that many prominent rabbis or Talmudic scholars, but there were quite a few very important people. It's a very long list. This is just a sample. So we have Rabbi Bergman, who was Minister of Environment. Rabbi Abraham Schwartz, he was the founder of the seminary. He was a principal, sorry, not the founder, the principal of the seminary in Latin America. Again, as I said before, the prominent movement in Argentina was, until the 90s, was the conservative movement. So they had a seminar, and a lot of rabbis studied in that seminar, and they went out to the rest of Latin America, to congregations around Latin America. And as a matter of fact, this is Rabbi Marshall Mayer. He was the founder of the Latin American Rabbinical Seminary. And the rabbi there is Rolly Matalon. He is the rabbi of Bnei Shurim, which is the big conservative synagogue in Manhattan, Upper West Side. But besides from that, for example, in the arts, we had Marta Argerich, is one of the greatest pianists in the world even today, and pianist and conductor Daniel Borenbaum. He conducted a lot of Israeli Philharmonic. He's been to Israel many times. Also in science, we have Byron, who was the inventor of the ballpoint pen, the first ballpoint pen that works. And Cesar Milstein, who was Nobel Prize of Medicine for his research in biology. Now, the Jewish community in Argentina today, of course, faces the same problem that it's faced by all the Jewish communities around the world. In Argentina, maybe it's a little bit exacerbated. It's 70 to 80% intermarriage out of faith. In other words, I'm not talking about intermarriage between Sfaradim and Ashkenazim now. I'm talking of marriage out of the faith. Thankfully, the ones that are not going out of the faith are moving to be more observant. So, as a matter of fact, the most influential movement in Argentina today is the Orthodox movement. They really have, I don't know to call it control, but mainly they're on the 90% more or less of the synagogues in Buenos Aires. Now, as far as the future, really does not look too pretty for two reasons. The first one, of course, as we said just now, the level of assimilation is extremely, extremely high. But besides from that, Argentinians are for a change, because it's been the case for the last 100 years, but it's in a very, very deep economic crisis, maybe worse than it was ever before. And as usual, when the going gets tough, anti-Semitism tends to flourish. So there is a lot of really a lot of concern on both sides. There's been a lot of aliyah from Argentina lately to Israel, and also going mainly to other Spanish-speaking countries, mainly to Spain, simply because it's easier because of the language. So, and with that,
That's a call. Thank you so much. We're going to now open up to questions and answers. We have some people here. We have some people on Zoom. Please feel free to unmute yourselves.
Yeah, Michael Platzer, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. You mentioned the Jews of Argentina starting in the latter part of the 19th century. When did Jews first come to Argentina? Do you know?
Yes, I said it started in the 1850s, 1860s from Western Europe, but it was, I think we don't need the thing here.
Yeah, you could turn that up.
So it started in the 1850s, 1860s from Western Europe, but it was a lot of drip drop. The main, when it really started in earnest, was toward the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, 1895, 1905, the same time as the first Aliyah.
So there were, what you're saying is before 1850, there were virtually no Jews in Argentina. Is that what you're saying?
No, not that it's registered or that it's known.
Oh, there's nothing.
I mean, there might have been some, I presume, but it was a big country.
And I have just another quick question. It was very interesting. You said there were a lot of Jews that came from Turkey and Morocco to Argentina.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know why at that point did they come to particularly to Argentina from Turkey and Morocco? Do you know?
Argentina had a lax policy of immigration, honestly.
Okay.
To some extent explains also why it was easier for the Nazis to come in.
Uh-huh.
Immigration, they always looked for immigration. It's a very large country, not as populated as the United States or as other countries. So they always tried to get immigration. Started, of course, with the first locals were, of course, the people from Spain, but they tried very hard to bring Italians, for example, a little bit later on, around also the 1850, 1860. So there was a policy in the 50s, 60s, and that's how the Jews most probably got there, of giving parcels of land, dividing the land that was public land, and giving it out for people that wanted to work it. And so in the 1930s, again, the policy, the immigration policy was pretty open, a lot more open, most probably than what it was in the States, and people were just looking for opportunities. There were very good opportunities. The country was progressing very nicely, especially in the later part of the 30s, when the world started getting into getting quote unquote ready for the Second World War. Argentina was really in a lot of prosperity. As a matter of fact, they were in prosperity because they also were neutral during the First World War. Just finished the First World War, a lot of prosperity. So a lot of people started coming to enjoy that, right?
Thank you.
Thank you.
When we made Aliyah in 1988, there was Russians, Romanians, and a lot of South Americans. And one thing that we noticed, they all spoke great Hebrew. So, I think that must have been something, as you said, they weren't religious, they had no idea, but the Zionist factor, they had wonderful Hebrew that they learned from school.
Correct.
But why was there such an aliyah in 88?
You think it was in 88 or they had
Well,
come a little bit
aliyah,
earlier?
it may have been trickling in by then. But
Correct.
there
The
was
Aliyah,
Russians,
the wave of Aliyah started in 1976, really, when all this civil war started. It might have gone on for a few years later into it, but it started in 1976. As I said, it's not that a big percentage of the Jewish community was on the extreme left, but yes, the percentage of Jewish people in the groups of the extreme left were a lot higher, the percentage that in the general population. Other than that, I can't think any other reason.
And the aliyah now is, again, you said it's up again.
Now because of the terrible economic situation they're in. I mean, it's desperate, really bad. And not only is really bad, is that I don't think it's going to get better anytime soon.
Do you have family still?
Yeah, I have cousins and friends from childhood, and they confirm that the situation is terrible. I mean, the young people, especially millennials, even younger, they feel that there is no future. The government keeps on being, all the governments are there, but the government now also is extremely corrupt. It's a pity because a very extremely rich country. My dad used to have a saying to say that as much as politicians try to bring Argentina down, they can't, because whatever they steal during the day, it grows at night. At night, when they go to sleep, everything grows back again. Well, it seems that they caught up because really the economic crisis is very deep right now. So people feel that there is no hope, really not opportunities.
Any other questions from anybody on Zoom? Okay, so
Is there a lot of anti-Semitism? Can you address anti-Semitism in Argentina?
I don't know if now, I mean, I've been out of Argentina since 1973. I mean, I've come to visit. But in general, I would say, I don't know what level of antisemitism. I don't think there is violent anti-Semitism, but I think there is anti-Semitism. Usually happens when the economic situation is bad. I had anti-Semitism when I was in high school. It was not violent anti-Semitism, it was passive aggressive, if you may. And I'm sure there is that now too. I don't think, again, that it's violent, but there is. And, you know, thankfully, Jews, we do have where to go when things get tough, right? Thank goodness now is not the 30s and it's not the 40s. We can go to Israel now. So I think that's what a lot of them are doing. Any other questions?
Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. A big round of applause. Really, really, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
And please, again, stay tuned for future programs. We have some more exciting mini-series coming up in the end of December, February, January. So please join us for other programs. I'm going to turn off the recording now.